building on top of the narrative language measures. We have a reading form and a listening form. And there are often questions as to why we don't have listening forms for the upper grades. So what is the difference between reading and listening comprehension? Is there a difference? What are your thoughts on that?
That's a great question. That's a question that's debated frequently. Is there a difference between reading comprehension and listening comprehension? Well, I mean, clearly there's a difference because of the modality of how you're accessing the language, whether it's through the oral modality or the written modality. So there's a difference there. Is there a difference in the language itself? Not necessarily. There doesn't have to be. Some people really think that written language is more complex than oral language, but that doesn't have to be the case. And there's very much the possibility to talk in the complexities of written language. That's not beyond the scope of the human ability by any means. So why do we have the fourth grade passages for the cubed and up? Why are they reading passages? Well, for the most part, by the time students are in fourth grade, most of them can decode with sufficient accuracy and fluency to access the code and convert that code into language, to decode it. That's not always the case, though. And so just to be clear, those forms can be converted to a listening form very easily. All you simply do is read to the child instead of have them read to you. So we do treat oral and written language quite interchangeably. And I know that that's sometimes that's considered a unique approach, right, to do that. But I always just like to mention that I listen to a lot of audiobooks and I still can understand them, even though it was written originally in written form.
Mm-hmm. So I also, reading comprehension, I would say it's one of the greatest, I don't know, mysteries of our time, really. We have some great scientists, great reading researchers, really trying to unpack what reading comprehension is. And they've been at it for a long, long time. One of the ways I think about it is that reading comprehension is a product. It's a derived repertoire, not the direct repertoire that we teach. We teach decoding or word recognition, and we teach listening comprehension or oral language, a constellation of oral language skills. And when you put those two directly taught repertoires of word recognition and oral language, you derive reading comprehension. Now, it is possible to measure comprehension based on a passage that a child reads, decodes, okay? But there is such tight alignment with their ability to understand a passage, whether they hear it or read it, as long as the decoding is sufficient, as Doug said. If they're sufficiently accurate, right, and the code doesn't have to be a barrier to it, there's such tight alignment in the listening comprehension and reading comprehension abilities that we probably don't need to assess both we probably don't need to assess both in order to ascertain whether or not they have comprehension.
Yeah, I've been giving this a lot of thought lately about beyond the simple view of reading, right? The simple view of reading, but Hollis Scarborough's work and Duke and Cartwright's work, and the more that these models get more complex, in a sense, still the more simple the formula really is. And if someone can decode the words, then, and they don't understand what they've just decoded, then you absolutely have to turn your attention to something else, to some other factor. And very often that factor is a language comprehension related to one of those constellation factors, one of those aspects of language.
At least one, but
at
most
least
often
one. That's
it's
right.
Multiple.
That's right.
So and kind of like all of them.
Yeah. And I also do appreciate the very clear, obvious role that attention and memory and executive function play in this as well? Because it's possible that you can decode something and that you could understand that language beautifully, but you just simply weren't paying attention or weren't motivated. And so that's a factor also, which I appreciate being brought into, recent models of reading.
Can I say something about that point, Doug? So oftentimes, people question whether or not the NLM listening or the NLM reading are actually just measuring memory and attention to those things. And I say, and so what if they are? That's part of reading. It is part of our conceptual model of reading. So it's actually better that it's there, because if we try to isolate those things, then we're not really capturing what that child's ability to comprehend is, right? If we've controlled for it, then it's no longer a contributing factor. But if we integrate it, which is where we go with our NLM listening and NLM reading, these are all integrated factors, because reading is a cognitive linguistic process act, right? We have to have cognitive and linguistic resources activated together, and memory and attention are part of it.
Yeah, right. And I really do think that the simple view of reading really should be three factors, right? That it is word recognition, which is constrained, and you could just put that on a variable of 0 to 1. That you multiply that by 1. And then language comprehension, oral language comprehension, that's unconstrained. And I don't know what metric you would put that on, but it could
Infinite.
infinite, I suppose, right? And then I think also the third component, which I would say is multiplied by the product of those two, of word recognition times language comprehension, and then you multiply that by your cognitive linguistic, your executive function, that factor that's hard to label, it's multifactorial, but that also really leads to you going deeper than what's written on the page, right? Making inferences, and the extent to which you can attend to it and make inferences and so forth. That's a formula one of these days we might have to write down, because I think that it really does it's a much more mathematically accurate representation of reading comprehension.
Yeah. So by creating a formula that looks like that, what people perceive as a confound in our assessments would understand, oh, that's intentional, right? Because that element of the executive functioning, memory, attention, whatnot, is a critical element in the reading process. Has to be.
And you set aside earlier the idea of background knowledge. And nowadays people are talking about language as though it is synonymous with background knowledge / vocabulary. That I see that phrase there as like a placeholder for language. And that's incredibly dangerous. And I'm not suggesting that background knowledge isn't crucial. However, background knowledge, if you expect to be able to teach a child every possible topic that there is to learn, that's an impossibility. So teaching and testing background knowledge is so incredibly confounded by experience and whatever you're specifically taught, right? So you've got to either go back to how well can children make connections from what they know to new material, or you can do what we tried to do with the cubed, which was we are using content that is universally understood by almost all children, regardless of culture or experience, which is things like personal experiences that children experience, like getting hurt or getting lost. And when you do that, you control, or we're attempting to control for background knowledge by focusing on those things. And then, of course, getting information on a child's ability to make connections. That is part of the cube construction.
Okay, so I just want to say that again, and in a slightly different way. This is very good, Doug. So when I put background knowledge aside, it wasn't because it wasn't important. It's because background knowledge is also like the thing that you get right? When you can access the world or experiences. And it's going to improve. It comes back in and improves all those things. But in our assessment tools, we've attempted to neutralize the impact of background knowledge so that we can actually isolate the teachable, the malleable factors that teachers have access to, which is vocabulary, language structures, verbal reasoning, and literacy knowledge. Said another way, the discourse, sentence, and word level complexity with inferencing. So those 4 things are the things that we can actually directly teach, right? And if we teach, now we neutralize it for our assessment tools for good reason, so that we don't advantage the, the upper class or the middle class, kids who are middle to upper class. We don't want to advantage them on the assessment because that's not what we're assessing, right? Really, the other skills are the skills they need to be able to learn from their experiences and gain more background knowledge naturally, like those other kids already have done and are already doing. So in an instructional context, the word, sentence, and discourse level patterns and the ability to inference would help children gain more background knowledge, right? Gain more understanding of the world, gain more understanding of this context or this game, or, what happens in this when you go to a museum or whatever it is. So then we kind of leverage those other skills to help kids gain access to background knowledge. But teaching it directly is that's like what Doug said, like we can't really teach it directly.
And this conversation is about the cubed, and think about how confounded that process would be if we decided to just measure specific content. And this is supposed to be a general outcome measure for universal screening and progress monitoring that is implemented across the world. Think about the extent to which focusing specifically on just a few topics that children may or may not have been exposed to or taught would really confound the results of the cubed assessment. A child's performance could completely be dependent on whether they were taught that topic or not. And so that's the reason why the cubed assessment measures oral language, and it does so with a narrative, and it's a personally themed narrative, not about a specific topic other than an experiential topic that most children will experience. And I wanted to say something else about that, but I forgot what I was going to say.
I think it's great. I don't know. It's funny because even this thing about the background knowledge, it's like, I don't know that we've had an explicit conversation about it, but yet we have the same understanding about why we're intentionally not testing that, but we're intentionally including memory and attention, in the assessment.
Yeah.
I don't know that we've been that. Have we? Or was this
No.
something we talked about many years ago and we forgot?
Well, that's possible. We've known each other a long time, but it's been a long time since we've had a conversation about background knowledge, if ever. I think one of the things I wanted to bring up was this idea of contextualized language intervention. And that's the big umbrella term, in my view, contextualized language. Just like the umbrella term for word recognition is synthetic. Contextualize is what applies to language instruction. And what is the context? Well, that's the content, right? That is where that background knowledge is built. The thing that I really want to chat with you more about, Trina, is the generalized skills and repertoires that you need to focus on with language, and how that has to be applied also to your instruction in the context, to background knowledge, right? It can't just be about, I'm teaching you about mitochondria today.
Yeah,
I mean,
no.
that's wonderful and fine, but when you're trying to improve someone's general ability to understand complex language, then I think you've got to get to the generalizable skill of making connections and inferences.
Well, that's what I swim in every day, right? Why we actually don't teach content. My principle number 1 is teach patterns, not content. And when you teach patterns, you'll get content for free because you have to, it's incidental as it. So if we were teaching things like word, sentence, and discourse structures, the patterns in the language, you've got to practice with content. And remember, retelling or retrieval is one of the very best methods of learning. So you're acquiring the content. So imagine that we were, let's say there's a passage about the bird-eating spider, the gigantic spider, right? Well, I'm not assuming any kid has ever experienced this gigantic spider, but my intention in that passage is to teach vocabulary, to teach complex sentences, and to teach the structure of that passage. There's a main idea, and here's some key details, right? That kind of thing. So if my focus is on making sure that they're saying those words and using those complex sentences and making sure that it's comprehensive, they had a main idea, whatever, guess what I also taught them? Content about that bird-eating spider for free. I don't have to focus on the content. I can focus on the patterns, and then the patterns transcend new content. Then next time we can talk about what's the pig? What's that pig that we did?
The sea pig.
The sea pig, right? Those patterns then can transport or be used in information or content related to the sea pig. Again, not content we would expect kids to know, but we can teach them that content with the focus on the patterns that is actually the needed element for generative repertoires. But if we just teach content, we just get content. That's why vocabulary by itself, it's like, you don't know this word, I'm going to teach you the word, you know this word. Well, that's okay, right? But that's not going to produce a generative repertoire of knowing all words. So, sorry, we could talk about that one for a long time. It's fun.